This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. As a painting conservator, the majority of works that I focus on are, well, paintings. But every now and again, I will turn my attention to a fun project, like a frame that needs some restoration work. It's a nice departure from the work that I normally do, and a chance to be a bit more creative in a field, conservation, that generally doesn't allow for creativity. Now, this frame was abandoned by a client, probably a decade ago. They brought the painting in, and the frame was too far gone for their appetite, and they encouraged me to just throw it away. They were going to have it replaced. But of course, I didn't throw it away because I felt that eventually I could use it. And now, with a little bit of time on my hands, because my schedule is so free and not overwhelmingly busy, I thought it might be a good time to try working on this frame. The first thing that I'm going to do is try to remove some of the gold paint that was applied atop the gilding to see what condition that gold is in. If it is salvageable, it will make for a very quick and much easier and much more cost-effective restoration. Some of this gold paint is really, really tenacious, however, and so I need to use a gelled solvent to remove it. Again, I'm still optimistic that some of this gilding underneath can be salvaged, but as I start to remove some of this paint, I'm seeing that much of this gilding has been worn and that it just simply won't tolerate the process of removing that old overpaint. Unfortunately, sometimes this is the case. In order to get off the overpaint that's on this frame, I'm going to have to remove the gilding. It's not ideal, but it is what it is. Ultimately, however, this frame is in really bad condition. There are huge sections of the ornamentation missing. In fact, the upper right corner is completely missing. There are chips and nicks and losses in the gesso layer, and it's generally in disrepair. So it's more than just a simple regilding or refinishing. This frame needs comprehensive restoration. After applying the gelled solvent and agitating with a brush, I'm coming back with some steel wool and going over the entire frame. The steel wool allows me to pick up a lot of that gold paint without sanding through any of the gesso. If I were using sandpaper, it would go through that gesso and it would be much more work. And I don't need to strip this frame down to its bare wood, I just need to get down to the gesso layer. If I had a media blaster, I might be able to do this in a media blasting cabinet, but I don't, and so I have to make do with the tools and resources that I have available to me. A brass wire brush makes quick work of those tenacious areas, and even though it's quite messy, really, really messy, I am able to get the frame almost completely stripped down to its gesso layer. And we can see the frame is in pretty rough condition. Like I mentioned, there are holes, there are chips, there are dings and dents. One whole corner is missing. The ornamentation is just completely gone. And it's going to need a lot of work for this to turn back into something that is worthy of having artwork displayed within it. But I'm up for the challenge. The whole function of a frame is to showcase and elevate the artwork within it. And in that case, it's a lot like a website. No, hear me out. Just like a bad frame can diminish a piece of artwork, a bad website gets in the way of the content. But a good website, a Squarespace website, can not only make the content look great, but can enhance the whole experience and elevate that which is most important to you. From contact forms to scheduling, to an entire e-commerce platform, and a whole new suite of tools specifically designed for content creators. Squarespace has everything not only to frame your content, but to elevate it as well, because your passion or business deserves the best delivery and frame as possible. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Kitchen of Conservation. Today we have a very special treat for you. We are going to be making gesso from scratch. That's right, no store-bought will cut it here. We're doing it the real deal. Now, gesso starts with a few basic ingredients. We have Gilder's white and rabbit skin glue. Now, Gilder's white is calcium carbonate or pulverized marble, limestone, and quartz, and it's the basic ingredient of all gessos. This white powder, when mixed with the liquid, will create the base for the gilding we're going to be doing on our frame. Now, the other ingredient is rabbit skin glue, and rabbit skin glue is made with hot water and, you guessed it, rabbit skin glue pellets. Now, this is an extract from the protein and collagen and connective tissue of rabbits after they have been processed. And to make rabbit skin glue, we take our hot water and we sprinkle in some of these pellets, depending on how strong we'd like it. And then we go ahead and mix it up. Using a glass stir, I'm simply allowing these pellets to dissolve into this hot water. So, on to the actual mixing of the gesso. We're going to take a few spoonfuls of the Gilder's white, calcium carbonate, and put it into a large mixing bowl. Now, once our rabbit skin glue has dissolved in the warm water, we are ready to mix it into the Gilder's white. And there's no set formula here, it's all experience and to taste. I'm going to add a little bit of the rabbit skin glue and then begin mixing it with a fork. And you can see right away we start to get a really nice thick consistency. But this is too thick for practical use, so we need to add a little bit more rabbit skin glue. Yeah! And you guessed it, folks, more mixing. Now, some people prefer to use an electric mixer or a whisk, but I prefer a fork because it doesn't add air bubbles into this gesso mixture. I don't want to aerate it. And one of the nice things about making gesso from scratch is that it keeps. You can put it into a jar and put it in your refrigerator, and it'll keep for several weeks, if not months, as long as it's kept cold. When you need to use it, you can heat it up in a double boiler, and then it'll be ready for your project. Now, there are formulas for mixing gesso, but like so many others, I learned from my father, who learned from his father, and so on and so forth. So this really is a hand-me-down recipe. And I think that's what makes it special. Well, there you have it, folks. From my kitchen to yours, you now have the recipe for homemade gesso. And I hope this carries you long and far in all of your gilding projects. Until next time, take care.
Okay, now that that is over, we can get back to some serious work. And the first thing that I need to do is start applying that gesso layer that I mixed up to, well, everything. And I'm just using a brush that's relatively soft, and I'm painting on a first scratch coat. This doesn't need to be tremendously thick. In fact, I don't want it to be. This is just to bond to the surface of the frame and prepare for the next coat. If I try to apply this too thick in one pass, it's going to be a goopy mess, and that's going to be a problem. So a nice thin layer is actually what we're looking for. Yes, it takes more time, but it's the right way to do it. So I paint it on, and that's really about it. I don't have to worry if it's really accurate or if it is catching all of the details just yet, or if there are a lot of runs. Again, the scratch coat is just to get some material on, and then we can start building up the next layers. And layers is the key word here. It's going to take 3, 4, 5 layers of gesso on this frame before I'm ready for the next step. And even though there is gesso on it now, the building up of these layers is critical because it allows me to have a base to work on. Now I'm going to have to fill in a lot of those losses. And I'm using some of the putty that I use with paintings because I'm familiar with it, it's easy to work with, and why reinvent the wheel? Now, what I'm doing here is trying to fill in the areas where the gesso really chipped off and has a big loss, or an area where there's a hole, or just an area where it needs to be built up and smoothed out. That's the key here. I need to build up any of the losses, make them even and smooth, because the next couple steps really do depend on having a smooth and unified surface.
So that's the name of the game here. Once all of the gesso has been applied and dried, and all of the first layer of fill-in has been applied, I can come back and start doing some more structural work. And here I'm using a 2-part sculpting putty, and I'm mixing it together, kneading it, just making sure it's a homogeneous mixture. And once it is, I can then start rebuilding some of these areas that have losses. Now, I could certainly try to cast them and replace them that way, but this is a hand-carved frame, and so there are going to be some subtle differences between sides. And in this case, I just need to build it up so that there's no massive loss. Once I've applied the putty, I can sculpt it using any number of tools, including silicone spatulas and dental tools. Now, with the fill-in completed, the sanding begins. And there is going to be a lot of sanding. I applied a lot of gesso to this frame. I applied a lot of fill-in medium to this frame. I applied a lot of putty to this frame. And now I have to turn a lot of that into dust. It's a sad truth, but the reality is that there's no real easy way to do this. You have to over-apply and then sand back. And what I'm looking to do here is to knock down any high spots and make sure it is nice and smooth in anticipation of yet another coat of gesso. Now in this case, I am trying to apply it a little bit smoother. I want to try to limit the amount of runs and drips because I don't want to have to keep sanding these down. Now I mentioned that the entire ornamentation on the upper right corner was missing, completely gone. I don't know where it is. And in the past, I might cast the upper left side, create a mold, and then pour a material in there and create a positive from that mold, and then fit it to the frame. But these ornamentations are directional, and on the upper left side, the leaves point out to the left, and on the right, they should point out to the right. So simply making a cast won't work. But what I am doing is making a digital cast of it. I'm using a handheld 3D scanner to scan this thing. And this scanner uses a combination of visible light and infrared and blue light or LiDAR, a whole bunch of fancy technologies, to effectively do the same thing that a silicone casting would do. Create an accurate 3D replica of this ornamentation in the computer. And once I've scanned it in, I'll take it into some software and I'll examine it. And you can see it's pretty accurate. In fact, it is really, really cool. But, of course, this is a cast of the left side, so I need to flip it and make a cast of the right. And now that I have the 3D model of the right side, I can 3D print it. I sent it off to a service because I don't have a 3D printer yet, and what came back was a 3D printed replica of the left side in mirror state. And I chose to print this in quote-unquote sandstone, which is a combination of PLA plastic and gypsum, which means that it is toolable. I can work this. It's not so hard that my tools won't be able to work it, and it's actually pretty receptive to being worked on. It's also really, really accurate. It gives a really fine 3D print, so the surface is really nice. But it does take some working because the 3D scan was larger than the area it needs to fit into. So using a multi-tool and hand tools and files and chisels and sandpaper and just about anything I have, I'm shaving it down and sculpting it so that it's going to match the frame. And it's pretty close. It's going to take some work to make it fit perfectly, but this is pretty awesome. Now, of course, I have to bond it in place, and I'm using a 2-part epoxy here because I want it to be permanent. I don't want to mess around with wood glues or hide glues. I just want this thing to stick on and stay on forever. And this is totally okay. Remember, I own this frame, and to some degree, this project is really a test to see if 3D printing is something that I can employ in the future, particularly with frame conservation. So with the ornamentation bonded to the frame, I can take off all of this tape and, well, A, make sure that it is actually really well bonded, and B, start to fill in some of those gaps where I didn't
3D print accurately. And I'm turning to that 2-part epoxy putty again, and I'm just going to fill it in and kind of shape it to match. There's no real trick here. You just kind of use your hands and make it look good. Remember, this was a hand-carved frame, so there are subtle differences between each side and areas where it's not quite perfect. And of course, more sanding. And this time I'm using a sanding sponge to get around some of those uneven areas. And again, more fill-in. This is a multi-stage process. Sand, fill in, sand, gesso. Sand, fill in, sand, gesso. Lather, rinse, repeat, all of that kind of thing. And more gesso. And this will probably be the final coating of gesso. One that is going to be smooth. It's going to go on the entire area, fill in all of those little holes and gaps, and also provide the final base for the final sand that's going to be in preparation for more steps. If there's one thing that I have learned working on frames over the years is that there are a never-ending list of steps that need to be taken. And just when you think that you've completed one, well, there's another one waiting. Sometimes as many as 7 layers of gesso can be put on a frame to get a nice smooth surface, which is critically important. The next step is the application of the bowl. Now, bowl is a combination of rabbit skin glue and iron oxide and a whole bunch of other fun ingredients, and this is the base for the gilding. Now, you could certainly gild directly on the white, but that's not very common, and it doesn't give a really warm feeling underneath. And since I'm going to be using real gold, I want to do water gilding, I need to have this bowl. So after applying the first coat, I'm going to roll up my white sleeves, which was a critical mistake on this day, and I'm going to start sanding. And sanding. And sanding. It is here where, had I not lost the video, you would see me applying a layer of black casein paint to part of the frame. After masking it off, I applied several coats of this protein-based paint, it's effectively milk paint, to this tray area. Once it was dry, I came back with some oil-free steel wool and I started sanding it down to give it a little bit of a worn look. I want some of that red bowl to shine through. After that, I come back with some Belgian linen and I start polishing it, because it gets a really beautiful sheen once it's polished up. One thing I also did that I lost the video footage for was polish all of the bowl. You can see some of the areas, particularly the high spots, are really shiny. Well, that's critically important for the gilding step, and it's done with a piece of Belgian linen, just like polishing the casein. It's also important because it makes sure that that surface is really smooth and really hard. Again, something that's critical for water gilding. After I have polished up the black area, I'm going to come back with some asphaltum, which is a printmaker's resist. It's used in etchings, and it is basically just asphalt in solvent. And when applied to the black, it gives a really rich, dark, warm quality to an otherwise cold black. It warms it up a bit, the brown comes through, and it looks just really gorgeous. It also buffs up to a beautiful sheen. It's at this point that I can remove this masking tape that I put on, because this area that was covered by the tape is also going to be gilded, and had I not done this, it would have been a real mess, and some of the black or the asphaltum would have contaminated that bowl and made water gilding impossible. But as you can see, it has left me a really nice surface, and I'm ready for gilding. There are any number of materials a gilder may use on a frame. They may use Dutch leaf, which is pounded aluminum or brass or copper, or they may use real gold, which is what I'm doing in this case. I'm using a white gold, and each leaf comes suspended between 2 sheets of tissue paper in a booklet. I'll then lay it onto a gilder's pad, which is a piece of suede wrapped around a board, and then using a gilder's knife, a long, sharpened knife, I will cut the gold into sizes that are more easily managed. Then I'll take a little bit of Vaseline and rub it on my forearm, and then I will use a gilder's tip, which is a squirrel hair brush, to create a static charge against my skin, and then use that to pick up the gold. But before I do that, I need to apply the liquor. And this gets its name because oftentimes it is liquor, of vodka. But in my case, I'm using water with rabbit skin glue. And then, using the gilder's tip and the static, I'll pick up the leaf and then try to apply it to the frame. And you can see just how poor of a job I did right away. I would be fired if this is how I operated, but luckily, because I own this frame, the client can just take their complaints and, well, keep them to themselves. Like anything, if you don't do it all that often, you become out of practice. But the more you do it, the better you get. And so as I go along, applying the liquor and then applying the leaf, you can see that my technique does get better. And by the end of the frame, I'm moving at a much faster pace with a lot less breaking. Now, this is a relatively easy section to work on. I'll apply the liquor, let it sit for a minute, cut the leaf, apply the leaf, move on to the next spot. It's relatively flat, so it's not all that complicated. And once the leaf is applied, I'll just leave it. Now, on these larger areas, it does take a little bit more finesse. I have to apply the liquor, and then I have to kind of roll on this leaf. Now, I'm doing it very slowly because I'm not very, very good at this. And I have seen people who are professionals, and they move at a pace that makes it seem like magic. They just throw the leaf right onto the frame. On these more complicated areas, like the ornamentation, I've cut the leaf into smaller sections, and I'm applying it, but there's still a lot of breaking. You can see how much it's tearing. This is not the end of the world. I will come back later on in a second pass, and I will repair all of these areas by patching it with smaller sections of gold. That's one of the nice things, is that any piece of gold that is fallen off of the frame can be used later to patch. Now, professionals usually don't need to do as much patching as I do, but I am totally okay with that. After letting the gilding sit for a couple of minutes, I'll come back with a cotton ball and just tamp down the gold to make sure that there's good contact with the bowl. As this water dries or is absorbed into the bowl and then dries out, it's imperative that the gold is really making good contact. Once it's all dry a day later, I can dust it off with a brush, get rid of some of the loose areas, and then come back with a burnishing agate. And this is just a tool, a piece of agate on the end of a stick that's used to burnish the gold. And you can see it starts off as kind of silver but kind of matte. And as I burnish it against that hard bowl, this is why I polished the bowl, to enable the burnishing. It's almost a mirror finish. And it's really, really pretty. Now, if I didn't polish the bowl, I wouldn't be able to burnish it. And if I wasn't using water gilding, I wouldn't be able to burnish it. So you kind of have to know what the final outcome is before you start to make sure you choose the right materials and technique. And just like the sanding, the burnishing is a tedious process. But when it is done, I'll come back with some of that steel wool and I'll start rubbing over the frame. And I want to rub through some of this gold, remove just a little bit of it so that the red bowl starts to show through. It's a really, really pretty finish that gives depth and texture and nuance to a frame that is otherwise really, really shiny. I'm not a big fan of really, really shiny frames, and so this kind of weathered, patinaed look is exactly what I'm going for. Seems crazy to rub off all that gold that I just put on, but that's what I want. After distressing the gold, I'll take some wax-free shellac and a little bit of dye and mix it together. Now, the shellac does have a little bit of color, but I want a little bit more. I want a warm shellac, so I've added some yellow and some red to give an orange tint to this shellac. And once I mix it up, you can see just how beautiful it's going to look. I'll start to apply it on the frame. And I'm doing this because the white gold is just too stark for my tastes. I want something a little bit warmer. And by applying this layer of shellac, I can give it some color so that it has a different look. You can see, compared to the top, just how warm the bottom is. I can build up this shellac in multiple layers or in different areas as much as I want. And it doesn't have to be warm. It could be blue or green or any color of shellac that I so desire. This is where the creativity comes in, getting to tone and tint and weather and patina the frame to match whatever is in one's head. And as a final step, I'll take some more casein paint, this time a raw umber, and I'll just start painting it into the recesses of this frame. Under the areas that I didn't get with the gold, into some of the nooks and crannies,
kind of everywhere. And as it's painted on, I can start to bring out some depth in the frame. That's really what I'm going for here. A frame that has a lot of texture and a lot of depth and a lot of visual interest outside of just the ornamentation. So by applying all of this paint, and then, key point here, removing a lot of it, rubbing it, burnishing it, really just kind of glazing in some of these areas, I can give the frame a little bit more interest. And I'll do that throughout the frame on all of these pieces of ornamentation to make sure that they're standing out the way that I want. One thing that I noticed when I did the gilding right off the bat is that the frame was so shiny and so flat that it was overwhelming and it didn't have much character or personality. And I like my frames to have character and personality, like worn jeans or scuffed up leather boots. I'm not a fan of frames that are super stark and crisp. I like them to have, well, some personality. After giving it some personality, I can come back with a soft cloth and I can just polish the tops of the ornamentation a little bit. And then, well, I'm finished. And here is the final product. This exercise really began as a way for me to test out whether or not 3D scanning and 3D printing would be a viable option for frame conservation. Certainly on smaller projects, it's not something that I would embark upon, but on a frame like this, where there was a massive piece of ornamentation missing, and I didn't want to spend the time or energy carving it, I think the 3D printing really worked. Now, the 3D printer wasn't cheap, and the 3D printing process was not cheap either, but if I take the combined cost of those, and then I figure out what the cost for me to carve this would be, I think I'm still ahead. And I have the equipment and experience to do it again. That aside, the frame, I think, looks really beautiful. The white gold is warm, it's inviting, it's weathered enough that it doesn't feel stark. And the black is really deep and rich, and because it's in that tray, it allows some of the ornamentation to stand out a little bit more. And speaking of ornamentation, well, it's really, really beautiful. All of the little work I did with the gesso and the fill-in to make sure that it was smooth and you didn't see the losses, well, this is where it matters. And even though the frame is weathered and has a patina, the fact that you can't see chunks missing or gouges, or the fact that there is a complete corner on the upper right makes a huge difference. And burnishing some of these areas, the high points, to a mirror finish gives another layer of depth to a frame that I think is just dripping with character and charm, and will make a perfect companion to a really beautiful piece of artwork. Only problem is that now I have to find a piece of artwork to go inside this beautiful frame. So remember what it looked like when it came in, covered in gold paint with that ornamentation missing and kind of falling apart? Well, it took a lot of work, but frankly, I think it was totally worth it. And looking at the final result, maybe I actually don't need to put anything in it. Maybe it's fine just as it is.